tell me a little bit about your background with comics, Ken.
Boy, I have a very, very diverse background in comics.
Okay.
Because I've written comics. I was writing stuff for Amazing World of DC Comics back in '75. I wrote my first story for Warren in '77,
Wow.
'78. I worked for Jim Shooter at Defiant. I was also a publisher for Evolution Comics, did Dangerous Times and New Frontiers. I've done a radio show interviewing writers and artists in comic books from '93 until 2006
Fantastic. Where? Where was that?
in New York City,
Okay.
50,000 watts from the Empire State Building,
What was the name of the station?
WBAI FM.
I know WB.
99.5, yeah.
99.5, exactly.
Yes.
That's
So I was doing that for all those years. I put out fanzines. I've run APPAs. I ran the Comic Art Fan Awards right after Timmy Isabella, right before Don Fortier. So I've done a whole lot. I ran a convention, Fireball. So I've done a lot of stuff in comics. And I know somebody asked you to talk to me because I know history,
Yes,
both of
which is something that I'm very
I know
interested in.
comic book history, and I also know comic book fan history.
What's the distinction?
Well, the comic book history is the history of the comic books
Comic book
themselves
itself, okay.
and their creators,
Right.
and comic book fan history would be a history of fans, which is sort of like a history of history.
Well, I would hope so. yeah.
Because, well, in the 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, there were no credits, right? It was like, you may have heard that, the movies didn't want stars because they were afraid that stars would demand money.
Of course.
Well, comics didn't want stars either, right? And the Hardy Boys, to this day, is written by somebody who's been dead 100 years. I mean, they don't want people to know the author of the Hardy Boys novels. I'll tell you what, no. Anyway, so comics didn't have credits. And then Stan Lee is really who got that going.
Stanley's the father of that.
And pretty much, I mean, EC put credits for the artists. All their artists got credit, but the writers didn't. And there was an EC fandom. Once you know who they were, I like Graham Engels more than I like, and so you just develop your favorites. You know why they're your favorites. For years, Carl Barks, who did the good Uncle Scrooge comics, nobody knew his name. They knew there was a good duck artist, and then there was everybody else, but nobody knew his name. And then one day, by accident, some fan discovered Carl Barks and his name, and suddenly they had somebody to put to it. And so 60s comics fandom, where they were like detectives trying to find out who did these things, who wrote them, who drew them. So you get a hold of one person. Who did you work with? Do you remember the names of anybody you worked with? And you go, oh, there was a Joe something. I don't know. I don't remember. And then you hear somebody else, and you go, oh, I forgot. There's a, whatever. And then you finally you put it together.
Are you a New Yorker?
Yes.
Are you from, okay. What do you know about the derivations of Zap Comics and the underground comics in San Francisco? How that all began? Who fathered that?
Oh, that
it
was
all started with the printing press.
that was
from what I
Harvey
understand.
Kurtzman.
Harvey Kurtzman from Mad Magazine.
From Mad Comics,
Okay.
not Mad Magazine.
Okay.
Mad Magazine was Al Feldstein.
Okay.
What was going on is Mad was the first satire comic, all right? Widely successful, so it had a zillion imitators, all right? And one of the imitators was Panic. Well, Harvey Kurtzman didn't have time to do that and the war books and then another satire book, so they gave it to Al Feldstein, who was writing a lot of the horror and science fiction stories. And so he did Panic. So when Harvey Kurtzman left Mad to do Slicks, Al Feldstein took over Mad, and then when EC folded and became a magazine company, and all that we published was Mad Magazine, that was Al Feldstein, all right, who's now retired, lives in Montana. Does recreations of his old covers and ranching paintings and stuff like that.
Some of the San Francisco artists are here, S. Clay Wilson
Yes.
and Spain Rodriguez.
Yep.
I mean, I would think that back in the infant days, in the 60s, those guys couldn't get published because of the violence and the sex and all that stuff.
Well, yeah, yes and no. It's like they. Oh boy.
Who championed
Okay.
them?
Harvey Kurtzman and Hugh Hefner.
Okay.
All right, Hugh Hefner published, I think it was Help. It was either Help or Trump.
Okay.
All right, and I think it was Help, and Harvey Kurtzman was the editor, because Hugh Hefner's a big comic fan. Right?
Well, I did not know.
Big comic fan, big EC fan. All right, anybody who was a comic fan in the 50s was an EC fan.
Okay.
And I don't think we will ever see a company with artwork like EC again, because every single artist was not just good, but great to incredible. all right, and to have them all in one place at the same time, and there wasn't a weak artist in the bunch. All right, the weakest artist was great, instead of like incredible or and no company can afford to put out monthly comics and have that kind of, because it takes time to do great art.
Didn't they have a problem of getting published in the first place because of
Who the underground artists?
Yeah, because
Well,
of the sex and
well,
violence.
they didn't want to do that anymore. They didn't want to do the typical illustration. They grew up on Mad Comics. They grew up on that edgy sort of stuff, and you always want to go further.
So they wanted to push the envelope.
And Harvey Kirschman wanted to push the envelope. And we know Hugh Hefner was pushing all kinds of envelopes.
Right.
So you put together Harvey Kirschman and Hugh Hefner, a publisher guy, an editor guy, who got creators and all the classic underground to the late 60s were working for Harvey Kirschman in the early 60s. And it's clear from the art style that they got a lot from Harvey Kirschman and Wally Wood and Will Elder and all the guys from the Mad Comics. Mad Comics have been reprinted in paperback form, so your viewers can find them, but as paperback reprints or as relatively expensive reprints of the comics themselves. But you can get them.
Careful.
So you can see where it came from. And they just kept going further and further. And as the 60s developed and Kennedy was assassinated, and then King and the other Kennedy and stuff, and as the 60s developed and the anti-war fervor and the counterculture and everything, there they were. And they had the best mentor in the world, in Harvey Kurtzman, who was quite a wild guy. So there's a lineage involved in everything. No matter how good anybody here is, all right, they weren't the first to do that. And they had people who they were into. And the people they were into had people they were into. And so a lot of these artists, once you get going, like you may start in the industry when you're, so let's say you're 19.
Sure.
All right, Vince McCarrick, he's 19 years old, gets starting in the industry. All he knows is Marvel Comics. Gets going, he starts learning about some DC comics. Then he starts learning about independent comics. Then he starts learning about European comics. As you meet other artists in the business, and you find out what they're into, and you go from being a Marvel zombie and you get bigger and bigger, and you're because a person's style is made up of their life and all of their influences.
Right.
So that's why artist style changed, because their life has gotten in. They've lived things that they're drawing from now that they didn't used to have, and they've learned about more art that they didn't know about.
Do you find it hard to conceive that someone like either Spain or S. Clay, that their artwork now would be, that they would kind of be considered elders of the tribe, even though their stuff is as outrageous and as fresh as it ever was?
Well, they are elders. They are.
I'm letting you say it, of course.
Yeah, but it's they've kept going. They're still drawing and they're still doing wild stuff. They're not just resting on their laurels. They're not just regurgitating the same old stuff. Because why bother? I just might as well do a print of my old pictures. Well, they're not content. Artists tend to not to be content. If they were content to be content, then they wouldn't be artists. They'd be some wage slave somewhere.
Exactly. Right. Since you seem to have had your finger on the pulse of what's going on for quite a while, what's the next curve in the bend for comics?
Oh, the internet.
And
the internet.
All right. And how is it being manifested on the internet? For those of us who don't know.
There's all kinds of ways people are doing stuff. For those of you with an older computer but still want to see nifty internet comics, go to Zark.com.
Okay.
Argon Zark is a really neat internet comic that even me with a steam-driven computer can look at, which I have thanked him profusely for. Because dial-up modem, old computer, and a lot of comics I can't look at.
Okay.
All right. There's a lot you can do with movement. Now, a lot of people go, well, is movement, if it moves, it's not comics anymore, it's animation.
Exactly,
right? And so there's a gradation. I mean, at what point does some movement now constitute animation? At what point is like, that's not animation, this is animation, and you find something that everything moves.
Right.
So there's also...
So the internet is where it's at now.
Hold on.
Now I'm getting a signal that we're going to have to.
Yeah,
we have to cut
so
it.
we can move on to other things.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So
We'll get
to
more
be
of you
continued.
later.
To be continued.
Yeah, okay.